Welcome to Pivot Point. My name is Michael Neal, and I work at a school in Tennessee called Vanderbilt University. It's basically my job to learn with and from some of the most thoughtful, ambitious, and impactful individuals who have come through Vanderbilt's Leadership and Learning in Organizations doctoral program. Before earning a doctorate, these leaders partner with an organization, conduct a research project in that organization, and offer evidence-based recommendations that make a positive impact. We call this a capstone project. This is a show about how some of the most dynamic capstones were constructed and carried out, and the particular pivot points that made the project, but could have broken it.
What we discovered in conversations with group members is that all of the group members from the responders had very different ideas of what they thought the business leaders thought about these topics. And that's kind of where we all stopped and thought, that's what we need to know. That's what we need to uncover. We need to know before we go into this community and propose ways that we could partner and maybe offer some opportunities to businesses and their employees. So they decided that would be the starting point. Let's start with, finding out what their perceptions are on these topics, and then use that to frame our strategy for creating the partnership.
Today we hear from Dr. Casey Cover, who partnered with a rural racial justice advocacy organization. Casey's project investigated perceptions of the business community related to race, racism, equity, and inclusion as a way to inform next steps for the organization that she was working with. Of note in this interview is that Casey describes being initially unsure of what to do in terms of analysis, and how what she calls cultural models offer direction both as an organizing concept and an analytical method. She also points to the value of an ongoing and iterative lit review as central to the direction of the findings by the end of her project. Let's get to the interview.
My name is Casey Cover, and I am an HR professional and data coordinator for a public school district in Pennsylvania. My undergrad is in organizational communication, organizational development, and that led me to, desire to work in human resources, people and culture, which is my current role. And from there, I got my master's in human resource management. My human resources philosophy is that organizations should be investing in their people and that they will get more out of their workforce by taking care of their people. So that's my HR philosophy. I use the term HR because that's sort of what everyone knows. They know what human resources is. But I like to talk about the work that I specifically do, not as an HR coordinator, but as a people and culture coordinator, because I think it's a different approach and of what you focus on. When people hear the term HR, they think, compliance and, onboarding and, new hire paperwork and discipline and things like that. Whereas I think when I talk about it as a people and culture role, I'm talking about a more holistic view of taking care of people in an organization.
All right, well, give me kind of the helicopter ride or the elevator pitch in terms of the project that you did, and then I want to ask questions and dig more into it.
Sure. So I worked with a local grassroots organization in Pennsylvania, in a rural community in Pennsylvania, whose problem was that they wanted to enter into a participatory partnership with the business community in which they lived and operated to tackle racism and injustice. They didn't know how this business community that they were entering into, they didn't know how these individuals perceived these topics. And so that was the problem I was addressing, was what are the perceptions that these business leaders hold on racism, equity, and inclusion. And I did a qualitative study using interviews to uncover the cultural models on racism, equity, and inclusion within this rural business community. And then my findings, influenced my recommendations to disrupt the cultural models that the business leaders held on these topics.
And so tell me a little more about the problem that your organization was facing. First of all, why were they interested? You said they wanted to develop a participatory relationship with the business community in these ways. What was it? Why were they interested in these topics specifically?
Yeah. So there was an incident in the community in the late summer of 2020, a specific incident where a group of Black Lives Matter activists were marching from Milwaukee to Washington, D.C., and their march led them through the area. And this particular incident, the group of activists were at a section in their march where they were about to make an uphill stretch, and they pulled over alongside the road within the community where the responders live and work and operate. And a local resident shot at the group of activists. So this incident really was a catalyst for the work that the organization, they're called the responders, I'm not sure if I had said that yet, the work that the responders were doing within the community. It was the first time that this, small rural community really had a national issue happening right on their front doorstep. And this group decided that they didn't want to just, talk about the problems in the community. They wanted to be responders. They wanted to actively do something to improve the community, to improve relationships, to improve justice in the community. And so, again, that incident was really the catalyst for the work that they wanted to do. And they felt that this would best be addressed by working with local sub-communities within the area. For my relationship with the responders and partnering with them for this capstone, we actually discussed working with a number of communities and sort of narrowed it down to the business community, really just to make my research, my capstone project, a little bit more focused. They also are working with the local religious community, education communities. The business community was just one community group that we were focusing on, really to narrow down my capstone. One of the reasons they wanted to partner with the business community is this local community is a tourist attraction. They rely heavily on tourism.
And so they had this vision. They had this vision to create a partnership with the business community. And when they started talking to you about, what you might look at, what kind of investigation that you might do, what was it they had in mind in terms of what they wanted to know?
What we discovered in conversations with group members is that all of the group members from the responders had very different ideas of what they thought the business leaders thought about these topics.
Oh, interesting. And was this in the early conversations you were having with the responders?
Yes, in our early conversation. And that's kind of where we all stopped and thought, that's what we need to know. That's what we need to uncover. We need to know before we go into this community and propose ways that we could partner and maybe offer some opportunities to businesses and their employees in terms of workshops or even just having some conversations, because that was their idea going into it. We'll just reach out to the community, offer to do some workshops, some training, and that will be the end of it. But then when they discovered that we don't even know what they think about these topics, and this particular community is 85% Republican. So a lot of the members of the responders sort of had these assumptions based on media of well, this is what they believe. This is how they voted. This is what they believe. This is, so they were prepared to go into the community without a lot of support and with a lot of misunderstandings. So they decided that would be the starting point. Let's start with, finding out what their perceptions are on these topics. and then use that to frame our strategy for creating the partnership. It took a while. I want to say at least 3 or 4 meetings of talking about with a group of us, some representatives from the responders, and then also me observing some of their meetings with all of their members.
Gotcha. Take just one step back and describe the responders for us. Did they exist prior to this incident, and then it sounds like there's like a kind of a core and then a larger group. Can you kind of describe the organization a little bit?
Sure. They are sort of a spinoff of another grassroots organization that started locally, an upstanders organization that had been around for several years and covered a variety of topics in the community. But in the summer of 2020, following the murder of George Floyd, that's when they developed this sort of spin-off group of the responders. There's about 20 to 30 individuals. They're all volunteers that either live or have lived at one time but still have local ties to the community. They meet usually about once every 2 weeks. And it started out, again, in response to the murder of George Floyd and sort of this, rising national consciousness on issues of racism, equity, and inclusion. They wanted to meet just to discuss these topics. And we're really looking to, maybe have some conversations with some young individuals in the community. In June of 2020, we had a group of young adults put together a demonstration in the town square. And, they were really inspired by these young kids that were willing to go out there and put themselves out there. And, they wanted to talk to them and they just wanted to organize and, start having conversations locally. And they started doing book reads and things such as that. They had a couple of meetings with the young adults who organized the demonstration in town. And again, then that's when the incident happened in the late summer of 2020.
I'm curious if is this, are a lot of these people transplants from other places, or are these people that just have kind of had some consciousness around critical issues and racial issues and have always lived here?
Mostly the latter. Most of the people are in some way lifelong residents of the community. Some are transplants. There are a few that moved to the area.
All right. So you end up deciding with these folks that we need to better understand the perceptions of the business community, specifically around these particular issues. And so talk me through, how did you decide to investigate this problem, call it a problem or an issue? Yeah. How'd you decide to do that, and why'd you decide to go at it in that way?
So my partner organization, they were very adamant up front that they did not want any surveys done. They did not want me to do surveys, yes.
Why was that?
They just felt that surveys were unreliable. Surveys are challenging to create, and they were more interested in getting qualitative data. They wanted these to be interviews. Interviews are focus groups, but they were pretty set early on that the data collection would happen via interviews. I ended up interviewing 22 individuals.
Okay. And what kind of counted for you as business community is the phrase you've been using? When you think about your sample, what were you going for? What counted in the sense of the business community?
Sure. So, first we were, I was targeting leaders from the business community because that's who the responders wanted to go out and create this partnership with. And so, had to clarify, what do we mean by leaders? And so that would have been anyone who, owns a business in the community or is in a leadership position in the community. So they could have, just been a manager or someone who's well established in the community as a leader. So to help identify who those people were, we started by, I started by going to our local business associations. So our Chamber of Commerce, and we have an Economic Development Association, and interviewed the leaders of those organizations. And then they kind of, in a snowball sampling sort of way, helped me identify other leaders in the community. the other thing I did was, sort of defining, or I actually created a sampling framework. So I started by identifying, the various industries within the community and sizes of those industries, so that I could be sure that I was sort of getting representation from various industry and various organization sizes as well. And so I used that when I went to the local business associations to sort of help me make the connections I needed to make within the community to, sort of target those individuals that are leaders in the business community. Then it was kind of this struggle of coming up with what my conceptual framework would be, knowing that they wanted interviews and knowing that what we were trying to capture was perceptions. And that's when, you helped me as my advisor, helped me discover a couple of different ways I could do that, and settled upon Jim G's cultural models as my conceptual framework for uncovering those perceptions.
For somebody who's kind of a layperson, what's the idea that G's after with this cultural models?
Sure. So cultural models are sort of these like subconscious ideas that we have in our mind about how the world works. So, one I like to use that Jim G uses as his examples is a wedding. So even if you've never been to a wedding in your entire life, you already have this idea of what's supposed to happen at a wedding. That it's a bride and a groom and they walk down the aisle, and, there might be a flower girl, bridesmaids and groomsmen. And so even if you've never actually attended a wedding yourself, that's the idea that you might have in your mind. And that's influenced by our culture, our social standing, the media that we consume. So somewhere along the way in our lives, we've developed these ideas of what a wedding is supposed to look like. And so that's that's what the cultural model idea is.
And you're starting to get at that idea of like what might either disrupt the cultural model, or if we have access to something that's not the predominant cultural model. So for example, a wedding of a gay couple, or perhaps it's a Indian couple and we're not from that culture or something like that. Am I getting it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So that's a perfect example. If you've never been to a wedding of a gay couple, you still might draw on that cultural model that you have of, a heterosexual couple.
So talk us through the findings. Give us kind of the gist of the findings.
Yeah. My findings were, the cultural models around racism. I had sort of two findings on that they drew on a lack of diversity cultural model and a politeness protocol cultural model. So the lack of diversity, what we found that was common across all the interviews were that the business leaders talked about how the lack of diversity in the area was both the reason for racism and the reason for not wanting to address it. So if there were people who held racist beliefs in the area, well, it was because they just weren't exposed to it. They've never been exposed to it. There's not a lot of diversity. This community's 98% white. But it was also their reason for why leaders didn't feel a want or need to address it, or to have conversations about racism, because in their mind it's not really relevant here. We're 98% white. What would we talk about? So that was a very common. That was common across all the interviews. That the lack of diversity.
And this is a good example, or a good time to kind of stop and point to the thing that you were just talking about a minute ago, which is like, yes, I saw that across all my interviews. I saw these kind of two ideas emerge, but it sounds like there was a point at which you said, oh, this is not something that just exists in this little community in this place. Like, this is a larger cultural model. Am I getting it right?
Yes. Yeah. So this is something that in research has been uncovered as a way that white people often avoid talking about racism because they because there's a lack of diversity around them. So this sort of paired with my lit review, I was able to uncover like this is something that actually happens other places as well, and is a way that people talk or don't talk about race. And then the other cultural model was the politeness protocol. And again, this was something that I was seeing across the interviews, and I didn't, my lit review is what gave me that term to go with it. So, the one thing that people were saying in the interviews is that they felt uncomfortable talking about race because they were white, or because they were, or because they didn't have a lot of exposure to it. And there was this fear of saying the wrong thing, and that they would rather say nothing at all than say the wrong thing, or that they just didn't want to offend anyone. And so
that's the politeness. That's the politeness. There's
protocol.
An expectation that we just, like, it's better to say nothing than to say anything.
Yeah. So this actually, came out in the lit review that, again, this is just something that in research has been uncovered as a way that white people avoid talking about race, is this politeness protocol. And so I don't know that I would have known how to term that if not for uncovering that in my research, in my lit review.
Got it. So it's like these breadcrumbs are coming together for you, and you're saying, here's this thing I'm noticing, but it was going back to the lit review is what gave you the ability to name these.
To name it, yes. Yeah.
What was it about this idea of cultural model, or you use the word conceptual frame, that opened up something? Why wasn't it just like, well, I'm just going to go find out what their perceptions are?
Because it's really hard to know what people's perceptions are based on what they're saying. And so cultural models is a way to uncover those perceptions by studying, how they talk about a topic, allows us to uncover what their perceptions are of that topic.
It sounds like the lit review in some ways was like iterative, rather than it being like something you did up front and then it was done. Can you talk a little bit about like how the lit review was both difficult but also productive in the end?
There was both a benefit and a limitation with that. So my problem was not knowing when I was done with the lit review, when I had enough.
Yeah.
And so it was an iterative process, because I finally felt like it was done when I was going through my findings and could circle them back up to my lit review. And that's when it all felt full circle. And I was like, okay, this lit review is exactly what it should be. It covered what it should. Because I was afraid early on that I was going to have to go back and really fill in some major holes in my lit review. And I did do that a little bit, but once I went through the findings, I actually ended up removing some irrelevant stuff from my lit review that just didn't apply to this particular capstone project. So my second finding was was asking about the cultural models around equity. And I had two cultural models that were most prevalent there, and that was equal opportunity cultural model and a meritocracy cultural model. And so the equal opportunity was how business leaders really place this emphasis on equality in terms of outcome. So, judging people based on, how hard they work and what they've accomplished, and this idea that they judge everyone based on how hard of a worker they are. They don't see color. They don't judge people based on the color of their skin. It's all about what kind of, if you're a good person, they're going to give you an equal opportunity. And so then from there, I really started to notice a difference in how they talked about equality versus equity. And there was really kind of this very evident misunderstanding of the difference. They really focused on this idea when talking about equality of fairness. What's fair, but then they didn't notice the inequities and the unfairness and the inequities. And then the meritocracy cultural model, again, this was something that I was able to pull out of past research, but it really tied into the equal opportunity one as well. But it was this idea of, I judge people based on their merits and not on the color of their skin, and how hard they work, their professional credentials, and that's really where they pulled in this idea of color blindness.
What you would call color blindness.
Yes,
Yep.
yes. A lot of individuals that, talked about not just that they thought themselves to be colorblind, but they were raised to be colorblind. That was part of, the culture of the community that, not to see color. There was not a sense of awareness that was problematic in any way. The third finding was the cultural model around inclusion was around this idea of an insiders versus outsiders is what I call the cultural model. And this meant that the community really correlated belonging with how well an individual has accepted and taken on the community's norms. They really place this heavy emphasis on that the only way to feel included and a sense of belonging in the community is to become an insider. So to act the way that the community expects you to act, to take on those cultural norms that are held and valued by the community. That's how you become an insider, and that's how you'll be included. So that's how they talked about inclusion within the community. And there were a few individuals that I interviewed that were not originally from the area, but even had lived here, over 10 years and still felt like outsiders in the community. Still felt like I've been here 10, 15 years. I had one individual say, this is the longest place I've ever lived, but because I'm not from here, I'm not seen as an insider because I maybe don't agree with them on this, or I've done this differently. And it,
in some ways, it goes back to the first findings of this politeness protocol and what's expected around, what it means to behave in certain ways here.
Exactly. They all saw me as an insider, because I'm someone who grew up here, and even though I might have, left for a few years, I came back. And that's important to them, that I came back. I know the people who live around here. I know the value that the community plays in everyone's lives. And so I was seen as an insider, which helped me gain access for these interviews.
So what do you then recommend to them, for what was next?
So I had 4 recommendations. My first one, identify and establish what they hope to accomplish within this partnership and how they'll know if they did it. So to establish specific and measurable goals. And the reason that was my first recommendation is that's what many people asked me at the end of the interviews. What do you hope to do with this information? And I don't know that I felt that the responders were not on the same page as an organization, as a group. Many of the members were hoping for different things out of these partnerships. And so I felt that it was really important, based on me being repeatedly asked that question, that they have very specific and measurable goals before entering into this community.
Right.
So that was my first recommendation. My second recommendation was for them to identify some key stakeholders within the business community with whom to take next steps. And this was because I was able to see how important it was for them to have someone with an insider status, to establish trust within that community. So by identifying stakeholders within the business community, and specifically individuals that, were very receptive to the work that the responders are doing, to go out there and sort of be the champions for this within the community. They would be individuals that were recognized as insiders that are trusted amongst the wider business community, and so that would be one step they should take to gain that insider status. My third recommendation was to maintain a stance of collective responsibility rather than simply blame. Instead of assigning blame as to who did or didn't act in the past, having a forward-looking approach to how they'll tackle these issues in the future. And maybe the most important one was, I shouldn't rank them, but was to offer learning opportunities designed to disrupt these unconscious theories that the business leaders hold on racism, equity, and inclusion. So a lot of these cultural models, were ways that we see racism exist in communities. And then the other thing, too, was when I was moving on to my recommendations, they didn't feel scholarly enough. Like, they just didn't, like, this is my finding, to offer learning opportunities to disrupt cultural models. Of course, that's a finding. It seemed too easy.
Yeah.
And that's where, having conversations with classmates and you, my advisor, really helped me realize that, for the responders, that wasn't an easy solution. They were too much in the thick of it to see that as a solution at all. So this idea that I was not finding something or not recommending something that was like good enough.
Got it. Yes, and I see why that was most important.
Where I actually saw more value come out of this was the local business organizations have since asked me to come and share my research with their board of directors and leaders within their group.
Wow, so wonderful.
Yeah. So it's created value for the broader community, not just the responders. The responders are using these recommendations as well in the way that they target these different groups. In fact, they've formed a subcommittee that's really designing the different learning opportunities that they're going to offer within the community, and then supporting me in presenting this research to those business associations, so that we can give them tools that they can use, whether it's within their own particular business organization or in creating future partnerships specifically with the responders. Right.
Got it. When you were having conversations with the responders after your findings, were there some surprises for them? Were there some people that were surprised by what you found, or anything about what you found?
I think they were not surprised necessarily on the findings, but they were very surprised in the willingness these business leaders had to discuss these topics.
I'm also curious, just in terms of your positionality as a white woman doing research on race, having conversations about race with mostly white people, with a white advisor. What was it like for you to kind of navigate that positionality and be aware of the work that you were doing?
Yeah, so, that was a challenge, because many of the individuals that I interviewed voiced some concern too. This idea of, I can't talk about that because I'm a white man or I'm a white woman. But then I guess I'll answer this way. We have an African-American individual in the responders group who shared with me that he was often approached by local community churches to come and talk about these topics in the community, and he refused. Because he didn't want to be the representative for, all of the diverse populations
right.
in the community. And that he felt that this is conversations they should be having on their own first.
Mm-hmm. It really goes back to the conceptual framework you chose, which is this G's idea of cultural models, in the sense that we're all drawing on these, right? You don't have to be, right? White people draw on cultural models to understand and make sense of what they see around race and racism. So it's like, just because sorry, go ahead.
Well, that was something I had to be very aware of, or that I became aware of as I was going through the analysis, is that many of these cultural models that the business leaders held on these topics are cultural models I myself have had to uncover and understand on my own journey. I was raised to be colorblind. Mm-hmm. My parents taught me, we don't see color. Mm-hmm. So I very much understood that was a cultural model. I was not surprised that was a cultural model shared within the community.
Right.
But that was one that in past work of mine, I've learned about and uncovered that was a way for me to kind of excuse or racist behavior in the community. So, it was really just kind of creating, helped me. I had to always be aware that these were cultural models that I've worked through, and am still working on as I continue this journey of my own.
Great. Casey, so nice to have you with us. Thank you for being willing to do this.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
So, what can we take away from Casey's description of this capstone work? One thing that stands out for me is the way that cultural models served as a conceptual tool that allowed Casey to really zoom in on what responders wanted to know. That is, how do business leaders understand racism, equity, and inclusion? As the idea of cultural models offered conceptual clarity and some kind of boundary for the investigation, it also provided an analytical method in terms of discourse analysis. So Casey was able to track commonalities and themes as business leaders discussed these matters, and then link those themes back to cultural models previously identified in prior research like politeness protocol and colorblindness. In these ways, cultural models offered conceptual clarity and methodological direction for analysis of the interview data. Thanks for listening. I'm Michael Neal, and this is Pivot Point. A huge thank you to the guests who make this show something worth listening to. Thanks to Peter Shellman for editing, mixing, and tech support. This podcast was made possible in part by a grant from Peabody College Dean's Office, for which I'm certainly grateful. Thanks also to the Capstone Partner Organizations, the hardworking Capstone Advisors, and Program Director Eve Rifkin, all of whom make these projects happen. And thank you for listening. Please take a moment to like, review, and share this podcast because that's the way other people are going to find it. All right, I'll see you next time, folks. I'm Michael Neal, and this is Pivot Point.